Hello, everyone. My name is Pradeep Naik, and I'm going to be moderating the session today. Thank you very much for joining from the different parts of the world. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Um, in my introduction, I'm going to do basically 3 rounds of introduction. One is an introduction to the partnership, V2B Global Partnership, that is hosting this particular webinar. And then the second part of my introduction is going to be a brief introduction to the thematic webinar itself. And then I will introduce our speaker today, after which we'll be listening to the talk by our speaker. So to start with the brief introduction to the partnership, Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership is a transdisciplinary research, knowledge, and action network with over 100 members from Asia, Africa, Canada, and internationally. The goal of this partnership is to support small-scale fisheries and fisheries communities in their transition from vulnerability to viability. And the way we define and engage in vulnerability and viability issues is not just to focus on economic aspects of vulnerability and viability, but also to bring into attention the political, the cultural, the ecological, and all other aspects of human life as they are impacted. Our focus is on co-creation and co-production of knowledge with regards to, of course, vulnerability and viability. Creating a repository in the form of an information system where we would capture this knowledge for the use of all that are interested and that are affected by the small-scale fisheries changes. Developing transdisciplinary capacity across all levels, right from the community to the academia, to the policy and civil society, and also engaging in processes of synthesis and integration of knowledge for governance of small-scale fisheries. The V2B Global Partnership aims to identify the diverse factors and conditions contributing to the vulnerability of small-scale fisheries and engage collaboratively with small-scale fisher communities and other key NGO, government, and university partners to enhance SSF viability. We are conducting transdisciplinary community-engaged research in 6 countries in Asia. That includes Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, Thailand, and 6 countries in Africa. That includes Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania. In doing so, the V2B partnership brings people and organizations together across physical, cultural, and disciplinary boundaries through a shared interest in addressing global impact on small-scale fisheries. The V2B thematic webinar series, for which we have gathered here this morning here in Canada, is an initiative of the V2B Global Partnership to facilitate and generate high-level discussions on vulnerability and viability themes and topics within the context of small-scale fisheries. The goal is to feature academic, government representatives, practitioners, and members of the civil society who have made significant contributions to the theoretical, practical, and policy aspects of small-scale fisheries, both locally and globally. B2B thematic webinar series takes place on the last Friday of every month, and it will be so throughout 2022. The series is available internationally through a live streaming on YouTube. Details regarding the monthly webinar series, including speakers, topics, and titles, as well as links to the webinar platform, is available on our website, which is www.b2bglobalpartnership.org. Today's webinar is the sixth in the series of V2B thematic webinars planned for the year 2022, and the 18th since January 2021 when we actually started. And it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Jessica Blythe as our distinguished speaker today. Dr. Jessica Blythe is an associate professor at the Environmental Sustainability Research Center at Brock University in Canada. She is an environmental social scientist engaged in interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research with expertise in resilience and sustainability science. Jessica's research pertains to the understanding of how communities perceive and respond to social ecological change, including climate change, and their differential capacities to engage in processes of adaptation and transformation. And we'll hear more on those things from Jessica in a moment. In doing so, Dr. Blythe's work follows two directions. One dimension of her empirical work is grounded in coastal systems, where she draws on complexity and commons theory to explore the influence of social ecological dynamics on resource management and livelihood outcomes. A second strand of her empirical work focuses on transformations towards sustainability. In doing so, Dr. Blythe considers all aspects of transformation and multiple possible outcomes, both the dark side of transformation and the bright side of it as well. So, over the past decade, Dr. Blythe has worked in multiple contexts, including Australia, Canada, Malawi, Mozambique, Solomon Islands, and many other places. I'm also very proud to announce, that Dr. Blythe is a co-investigator and an active member and a co-lead of the Knowledge Mobilization Working Group of B2B Global Partnership. Dr. Blythe has written and published extensively on various aspects of coastal and fisheries communities, particularly focusing on small-scale fisheries, also additional focus on resilience, sustainability, governance, but most recently trying to tackle issues of equity and justice. It is my honor to invite Dr. Jessica Blythe to deliver today's talk for the B2B Thematic Webinar Series 2022, and her talk is titled as Transformations Towards Ocean Equity and Blue Justice. Thank you very much for joining us today, Jessica, and the platform is to you.
Thank you so much, Pradeep, for the warm welcome. And thank you, everyone, for joining us from various parts of the world on this Friday. Where I am sitting is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. And we recognize that their contributions are part of the foundation for the incredible lives that we live here today. It's such a privilege also to join this incredibly distinguished list of speakers, 18 over the series, and I'm really pleased to be joining the thematic webinar series, which I've really enjoyed listening to thus far. So thank you for inviting me. And it's also been a really incredible week for small-scale fisheries. I've just come off, and many of you were probably there, the 4th World Small-Scale Fisheries Congress, which was held in St. John's, Newfoundland. So to me, this is sort of the cherry on the cake of this wonderful week of thinking about how small-scale fisheries communities, and in particular, these conversations around shifting from vulnerability to viability. So thank you so much, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here. It's my favorite thing to be talking about, and it's a joy to share it with you. So as Pradeep mentioned, my talk is going to focus on transformations in ocean governance. And I'm going to sort of talk about 3 things. I'm going to start with a few of the rationales and sort of arguments being made for transformations. Then we'll go to what Pradeep highlighted as some of the dark side and maybe the risks associated with transformative change. But I won't just stay in the realm of critique. I will finish, as Pradeep mentioned, with a more bright side and looking at potential solutions for helping to participate in transformations that hopefully are moving us towards more ocean equity and more blue justice, and how that can be part of potentially this large shift that we're trying to tackle through this big partnership of understanding and shifting small-scale fisheries from vulnerability to viability. So I'd like to start by situating this work in some of our early thinking around transformations and sort of where this came from. So essentially, the work began when we were noticing the word transformation was appearing everywhere. And this will be very familiar to everyone. Here's the Sustainable Development Goals, of which goal 14 we like to think is the most important. But all 17 goals are meant to support each other, and clearly they do. And they're framed on the notion of transforming our world. So that's one of the really high profile places we see the word come up. And while we wait for the sixth report from the IPCC of the Working Group 1, the previous one had an entire chapter dedicated to transformational pathways. And essentially, the report argued that if we want to meet our climate goals, transformation, so large-scale radical change, is going to be required. And I'm sure you've seen the word everywhere. It's in some of the rationale for the Nature Sustainability Journal. Many of us have contributed to special features on transformation, and a lot of us can get on board with the notion that the changes we are dealing with are massive, and therefore the responses required to mitigate risks of those challenges need to be large. They need to be transformational. So all this sort of work and support for the notion of transformation, I think, was brilliantly captured by Mark Pelling, whom is a scholar on climate adaptation and climate justice. He commented that transformation breathes. It has entered the life cycle of dangerous words. And what he means by that, of course, is that language has power. And regardless of intent, and the way that the language is written, it can take on many different forms once it becomes part of our discursive practice. And it sets agendas and it informs real world policies and actions. So it has material, potentially dangerous consequences. And so in thinking about that notion, we worked through various iterations of the word transformation through a discursive analysis to try and see how is this word being taken up in policy and what's it actually look like when it hits the real world. And so through that analysis, we came up with a list of, I think, fairly significant risks that were not being well enough acknowledged in the transformation literature, which we refer to as the dark side of transformation. And essentially, I'm an advocate for transformational change. I think that the challenges we are facing are massive, but I think that we need to do that with a real awareness of the way the word itself and then policies that are dictated by that can be misused, essentially. So I'd like to quickly walk through a few of these just as sort of a background to what potential risks are when we're talking about or advocating for transformational change. So the first one that we identified, the first risk, is that sometimes transformation discourse shifts the burden of transforming onto already vulnerable parties. And so a really tangible example of this is the report you're looking at, the Migration and Global Environmental Change report that came out of the UK, says that migration can represent a transformational adaptation to environmental change, and in many cases will be an extremely effective way to build long-term resilience. So if you're reading this and maybe you're not having your critical lens front and center, it's maybe easy to be compelled by this language and think, oh yeah, migration is this great transformational adaptation to climate change. But the reality is that's sort of a euphemism for the fact that people are being forced, often against their will, off their land or to move from where they live. And so scholars have rightly pointed out, this is John Barnett and Saffron O'Neill, that in many cases, people don't want to leave, and there should actually be a requirement for all of us who are parties of these global initiatives to protect the social and cultural rights of people living in places threatened by climate change, to adapt in situ and not try and frame their migration as a good transformational strategy. And this, of course, applies to small-scale fisheries as well. Often we hear talk of alternative livelihood programs that says, maybe the transformational change will be alternative livelihoods. But in many cases, small-scale fishers, I would argue most cases, small-scale fishers don't want to transform their livelihoods. They want to fish for all of the infinite reasons that we know of, if the cultural and social and spiritual and historic and generational benefits that are derived from lives made through small-scale fishing. A second risk that we identified was sometimes the word transformation is used to sort of distract from business as usual policies. And so one of the examples we provide in the paper is Jacob Zuma, who's here on the left, who was the president of South Africa. And in response to sort of a failing public perception and his loss of power, he reframed his political platform around this notion of what he called radical economic transformation. And at the surface, it might have sounded like something really different and potentially quite positive. But Mark Swilling from South Africa and colleagues did a really critical analysis of what was actually in that radically transformative platform. And they found that actually it was pretty much the same. They conclude that at the epicenter of the political project mounted by Zuma is just a rhetorical commitment to transformation. In their view, the term is being used as an ideological smokescreen to mask these rent-seeking practices of the Zuma-centered power elite. So essentially the same damaging practices, but sort of rebranded under the notion of transformation. So that's something that we urge is a risk of anything being framed as transformative, and something that we should be cautious of and bear in mind. A third risk that we identified is that often the transformation discourse pays insufficient attention to social differentiation. And, you know, this will be familiar to all of us that are aware that a single event has vastly different impacts depending on who is experiencing those impacts. There's never a sort of single experience of large-scale change. But often transformation is framed as a win-win scenario, or win-win-win, you know, triple wins, and that always raises red flags, with the assumption that everyone is going to benefit from transformational change. Yet we know that the same event will have vastly different impacts, and some may benefit, but others may stand to lose. And traditionally, patterns are very well established that those who stand to lose from large-scale change are often marginalized groups with little power. And unfortunately, that often tends to be small-scale fishers when we're talking about transformation in the coastal space and of marine resource use. So the fact that transformational change will be experienced in vastly different ways is a risk that we need to always keep front of mind when we're talking about transforming ocean governance. And finally, a fourth one I'd just like to touch on quickly, because I think it's very relevant in the context of small-scale fisheries, is that often transformation discourse excludes the possibility of resistance or non-transformation. So everybody can get on board with the idea that we want change and we need change. You know, nobody is ever really happy with the status quo. But oftentimes, if transformation is being advocated for by, you know, so-called outsiders to a community, local people and local fishing communities may actually be very resistant to the notion of transformational change. They might not want a large-scale green energy development in their coastal waters. They may not want 30% of their coastal waters set aside for conservation. And so I think recognizing resistance to, or the very genuine right to not transform is an important part of the conversation that we were finding is a little bit absent or underemphasized when we're talking about transformative change. And this poster that we're looking for, to me, is always such a powerful example of these grassroots resistance to change. So this is by Tracy Washington, who's a social justice lawyer in Louisiana, and it was after Hurricane Katrina. And local communities there, who were often Black and often poor, who bore the massive brunt of that hurricane, were often framed as resilient in the public media. And the communities there, with the help of Tracy Washington, were pushing back against that and saying, stop calling me resilient, because every time you do, it means you can do something else to me. So I'm not resilient. And I think these resistance to, you know, the downshifting of the burden to respond through language that is maybe being misused is important for us to recognize and to potentially guard against. So that's sort of a background of where we started thinking about transformation and the potential risks associated with it. But the notion now of transformational change is very much present in language around marine resources, small-scale fisheries, and the blue spaces in which many of us work. So as an example, the blue economy obviously is everywhere. And in many cases, the blue economy is being advocated for as a transformation. So this is a copy of Africa's Blue Economy handbook. And in the introduction to that, they say that the blue economy can play a major role in Africa's transformation. So this is another type of transformation that we wanted to engage with and really dig down into what that looks like for coastal communities. So we started with the fact, and this is drawing on the work of brilliant thinkers with whom we get to work, such as Stacey Jupiter, who has been really influential in my thinking on pointing out that many of these policy changes are advocated for very different reasons. So as these calls for transforming ocean governance are growing, we recognize that they're motivated by all kinds of different objectives. Sorry, I'll see if I can move this. There we go. So many people are calling for transformation for many reasons, sometimes which are in agreement with each other, but sometimes are very different from one another. So for example, some people are calling for the need to secure the rights of marginalized communities and transform the way that we allocate decision-making power, many of whom of us are probably in the V2V space and in the small-scale fisheries space. So for example, the small-scale fisheries guidelines are quite a transformative piece of policy. Some people are advocating to transform the ocean in order to boost the economy. The blue economy strategies are often based on that, and a lot of the blue growth initiatives we see, say that the terrestrial economy is lagging, and we can make up for that by developing the blue economy. So that's another and quite different call for transformative change. Another example is obviously the need for transformation in order to reverse biodiversity loss. And we can think of the 30 by 30 agenda as a really transformative piece of ocean policy or ocean framework that will really radically change access rights and interactions with marine resources in communities around the world over the next 8 years. And so in this paper, what we did was we dug into 3 different types of transformative change to sort of explore what does transformative change look like for ocean governance. So we looked at the small-scale fisheries voluntary guidelines as the first international and globally agreed on piece of policy in support of the rights of small-scale fishers. We also looked at debt for blue nature swaps in the Seychelles as the first example of these debt for nature swaps, which are now becoming more and more common in marine spaces. And then as a third example of a potentially transformative change for ocean governance, we looked at the UN ongoing negotiations for a treaty to govern the high seas. And so through these cases, we came up with a few conclusions, which I think are relevant for us who are thinking about and working with small-scale fisheries communities. So our first conclusion through the analysis of those cases is that governance transformations don't occur in a void, but rather they're situated within complex and often contested historical policy landscapes that shape how governance can occur. And so, for example, in the Seychelles, it wasn't just that somebody decided that debt for blue nature was going to be a good idea for ocean spaces, but rather that sort of market-based intervention, so saving the ocean by getting the prices right, was really sort of set in motion because of historical legacies of colonialism that led to very high debt profiles in Seychelles that made them, economically vulnerable and probably more incentivized to take on a debt swap. So recognizing that these things aren't just happening in a void, but rather they're really informed by what's happened in the past. Second, we find that governance transformations are driven by an array of actors with different objectives and varying degrees of power. These historically rooted power dynamics shape whose agendas and narratives drive transformational change and whose don't. And in many cases, we find that the narratives of small-scale fishers are often overshadowed by larger, more powerful, probably economically powerful voices who get to set transformational agendas. And that is obviously problematic if we are advocating for the rights of small-scale fishers. And finally, through that analysis of the three cases, we find across all three cases, transformations create uneven distributions of costs and benefits that sometimes facilitate progress towards a particular goal, but sometimes stall them. And transformational change is obviously very different depending on how it transpires. Sometimes objectives are articulated and negotiated in interactions that may reassemble rights, access, and control. And if I am an advocate, which I am, of, for example, the small-scale fisheries guidelines, I might say, yes, this has been transformative change that has actually reallocated and re-recognized the rights of coastal communities to govern and manage their small-scale fisheries resources. However, there's also potential that existing and often undesirable conditions become further entrenched rather than transformed at all. So we could argue that in the case of Seychelles, power structures were not challenged, but rather they were just further entrenched as a low-income country was made to be continually dependent on global economic policies and finance. So that brings us to the end of the risks and negative part of this talk, hopefully. But what we find, and it's important that we acknowledge, is that ocean governance transformation is associated with these highly inherent risks, and it's a very political process. And I think keeping those things in mind is very important. However, we don't want to just make critiques. We want to sort of think through what this could look like going forward. And so for the next part of the talk, I'd like to draw on a couple papers where we tried to look forward with sort of a solution lens and thinking about how small-scale fishers in particular could be served justly through processes of transformation. So in this paper, which we call Just Transformations to Sustainability, we draw on transformation literature on just transitions, a lot of that led by Mark Swilling in South Africa and other colleagues, and also social and environmental justice literature to advance a framework for just or fair transformations that draws on recognitional, procedural, and distributional considerations. And we wrote this paper in the context of sustainability broadly, but I think it also is very applicable to the context of small-scale fisheries. So this will be very familiar to those of you who are familiar with the equity literature, but just to make sure we are clear, recognitional justice refers to the acknowledgement of and respect for pre-existing governance arrangements, as well as the distinct rights, worldviews, knowledge, needs, livelihoods, histories, and cultures of different groups in positions of within decisions that affect sustainability initiatives or ocean governance initiatives. And I think traditionally that's been probably the least recognized element of justice. Next is procedural justice, which refers to the level of participation and inclusiveness in these decision-making processes and the quality of the governance process itself. So that is sort of how I think of it, as how we engage in decision-making around marine resources. And then the third element, which has received the most attention, but still not enough as far as I'm concerned, is distributional elements of justice, which define fairness in the distribution of benefits and harms of the decisions and actions to different groups across space and across time. And of course, perceptions of fairness are not homogeneous, but they're highly heterogeneous. And I think of the great work of scholars like Georgina Gurney and Jackie Lau, who have been working with coastal communities to sort of unpack and then highlight different perceptions of what is fair. And I think that that's a real challenge, but a real opportunity for us working in the space. So in our framework, we identify potential actions through these three elements of justice that could help transformations within coastal spaces be more fair. And I would like to sort of talk through sort of what that could look like. And hopefully it's a more positive and hopefully sort of inspirational part of the talk. So the recognition of all groups is the basis of all forms of justice. Without it, neither procedural nor distributional justice will be possible for some groups. Recognitional justice requires first the identification of all interest groups and rights holders who are present in an area and who might be impacted by a particular initiative. Special attention needs to be paid to representing diverse interests and to ensuring the involvement of those who are often neglected or marginalized in decision-making. This might happen through processes of identifying and ensuring the salience of all rights holders. An important step in this is the documentation of historic and current tenure and rights of different groups to both land and sea resources. And although that seems obvious, it's often been absent in a lot of transformational projects, particularly transformational projects that are very, fueled by crises narratives and this sort of urgency to act. But clearly the recognition of what has come before and what is already in existence needs to be front and center. For example, the rights of some groups to areas or resources might be given preferential treatment under the law, while for other groups, resources might be considered integral to their right to food. Research methods such as legal and policy reviews, mapping of Indigenous and property rights, and participatory spatial mapping of historic and current uses and rights can help to identify these legal allocations and spatial configurations of rights, and should always happen before any decision-making processes begin. The recognition of and respect for the traditional practices and institutions, knowledge systems, cultures, and worldviews and values of different interest groups and rights holders will necessitate that steps are taken to both understand and to meaningfully integrate these considerations into environmental planning and management. Methods such as stakeholder analysis, participatory action research methods, or social analyses could facilitate the documentation, the discussion, and the incorporation of these diverse factors into notions or projects of transformation. The documentation of local and traditional knowledge and mapping of diverse social and cultural values can enable the integration of this information with other types of information into marine resource management and planning initiatives. So those are some of the ways that we try to articulate through this framework that we can engage with recognitional justice in projects of transformation, and particularly ocean governance transformation. So next is procedural. More than just participation and inclusion, procedural justice requires engaging in a manner that ensures a broad set of qualities of good governance, such as transparency, accountability, legitimacy, responsiveness, access to justice are available to all actors. Principles of participation and inclusion ask us to consider who needs to be included in decision-making and how they should be included. Genuinely participatory decision-making requires the development of governance structures that adequately represent all rights holders, all stakeholders, and marginalized groups, and well-facilitated processes that ensure a diversity of voices and perspectives are heard. And we've heard that lots, but getting it right is something that I think we can all continue to work on. Being truly inclusive may also necessitate designing contextually appropriate governance and collaborative management processes that consider things like people's capacity, people's time. Something that we heard at the World Small Scale Fisheries Congress was, for a lot of small scale fishers to participate, we need to be sensitive to the seasonality of their fishing cycles. And if we ask them to participate in a governance process in the peak of their harvest, that's not going to be possible for them. And that's something that we need to always have forefronted in our mind. What's the capacity and what is the timing needs of our partners? I've lost my spot. The autonomy and sovereignty of different nations, local communities, and indigenous groups also need to be acknowledged, and the respect for the right to self-determination provided through ensuring free, prior, and informed consent are critical. The timely and accessible communication of scientific research and other information, and of the way that decisions are made, and of the rationales for decisions to all parties helps to provide transparency in part of a procedural justice approach. Upward and downward accountability mechanisms can help to ensure that parties are responsible for fulfilling their assigned duties and for other actions. As a general rule, and sustainability initiatives or small-scale fisheries governance initiatives need to be responsive and adaptive to different social contexts and to people's local needs. Legitimacy is provided by law, but can also be conferred by actors based on their perceptions of, trust in, and support for sustainability actions. Providing support for local capacity, as well as active development of local skills, ensures that people can effectively participate in decision-making and management. And finally, access to justice and conflict transformation mechanisms can help to mediate differences between more and less powerful groups and can help redress for past wrongs. And so those are some of the strategies that we sort of articulate in this paper for getting procedural justice right. And, many of you are pioneers in the field, but I think approaching this with a really healthy amount of humility and foresight will help us in making sure that processes and decision-making around particularly transformative ocean governance initiatives are engaged in a way that is respectful, inclusive, not damaging for all the relevant rights holders and stakeholders. And so finally, through this framework of how transformations can be navigated in a way that is more just and more fair, we outline some strategies for distributional justice. So the concept of distributional justice refers to fairness in how different groups of people benefit from and incur the harms of environmental decisions and actions across space and time. As a management norm, distributional justice necessitates that we understand how different groups will be impacted by changes to access and resource, allocations, benefits and harms during and after a transformation in governments. At the very least, facilitating just transformations will require identifying the potential economic costs and benefits of these types of initiatives. Understanding net economic cost can be accomplished through things such as basic cost-benefit analyses. However, to truly understand the distribution, this should be complemented by analyses of how these economic costs and benefits are dispersed between and within groups, across space and time, and over time. And we highlight in the paper some existing frameworks that we can draw on to do that in a way that is as equitable as possible. And while these analyses can be useful as a basis for deliberations on what actions to take, deciding what constitutes as fair or just is complicated by underlying philosophies and criteria for equity. And as I mentioned, some of the work from Georgina Gurney and Jackie Lau and colleagues on how diverse perceptions of fairness can be. Understanding the distribution of benefits and harm can be further complicated by the fact that a lot of these initiatives obviously don't just impact economic outcomes, but rather they also include social, cultural, physical, and political aspects of human well-being that are valued by people in various ways. For example, fisheries management success, as defined by economic and sometimes ecological objectives, can be viewed negatively by communities if there's an inequitable distribution of benefits, risk of increased conflict, and negative social outcomes. This can be problematic given the non-monetary values such as cultural values, identity, food security, and social cohesion that are really embedded in small-scale fisheries and that are particularly strong in the coastal communities with whom many of us are fortunate enough to work. So those are some of the ways that we articulate in this paper that we might better account for notions of these uneven costs and benefits of transforming ocean governance. And if you would like to read how that framework can be applied in practice, in this paper, we apply it to a case of small-scale fisheries in British Columbia. So I urge you to go and read that if it is of interest. So I'd like to turn to one final paper to finish. And we specifically take this thinking that we've been doing around what does transformation look like? What are the risks involved with it? How can it be made more equitable? And we apply that thinking to this notion of blue growth. And so many of you, I'm sure, are all aware that there is a massive surge in interest in the ocean of late, which is very welcome in many ways, but it is also challenging. This paper on the blue acceleration by Geoffrey and all, it will be familiar to you. And it essentially shows through these exponential graphs that all kinds of activities are increasing exponentially in the ocean. And some of these we could say are normatively good from our perspective, but others definitely carry huge risks to coastal communities and small-scale fisheries. One of those potential risks is this new language around blue economy, which obviously is interpreted very differently by different groups. But in many cases, blue economy strategies can be almost synonymous with economic development of ocean activities through exploitation of marine resources. And so in our view, the risks of social and environmental injustices stemming from these kind of blue growth initiatives are still sort of insufficiently recognized by those advocating for substantial change and substantial economic development activities in the ocean. So in this paper, which we call Blue Growth and Blue Justice, we identify through a literature review some of the risks that are inherent in these large-scale blue growth initiatives. And I'd like to walk through them quickly. So first, the recent acceleration of blue growth agendas has prompted critiques about the associated risks of ocean grabbing, coastal grabbing, and dispossession and displacement of local communities. For example, the extensive past and continuing commodification and privatization of fisheries resources, notably through the reallocation of fisheries rights and market-based regimes, has led to a lot of corporate concentration and loss of resource access for local users and small-scale fishers. Second, economic development activities can provide numerous toxic pollutants and other forms of hazardous waste that are harmful for both marine environments and people. Environmental injustices resulting from the impacts of these harmful substances on human populations are often disproportionately borne by specific groups. Often those are marginalized racial groups, women, indigenous peoples, and small-scale fishers. Research on the injustices caused by the oil industry, for example, demonstrates that oil development activities and spills have led to substantial physical and mental health impacts for local communities and small-scale fisheries groups in many places around the world. Third, environmental degradation and reduction of the availability of ecosystem services is often associated with blue growth initiatives. For example, shrimp farming in Latin America and Southeast Asia has led to the destruction of vast areas of mangrove forests that have previously provided essential ecosystem services, whether or not you will like that term, but essentially of healthy marine environments through which coastal communities have been stewards of and beneficiaries of for millennia. Fourth, blue growth initiatives are often associated with negative livelihood impacts for small-scale fishers. Evidence from the Philippines, for example, demonstrates that small-scale fishers' livelihoods can be compromised by the government's push under these blue growth initiatives to develop the tourism industry. In an extreme case, a fisher's boat was confiscated by a foreign owner of a resort, and the fisher reported that the local government was afraid to confront the resort owner on their behalf because of the power and the sort of economic influence that he exerted over the industry. Fifth is loss of access to marine resources needed for food security and well-being, which will be familiar to many of us. For example, blue growth initiatives can erode formal harvesting and access rights of local groups. Sixth is inequitable distribution of economic benefits. So potential economic benefits are often used as a rationale to support blue growth initiatives. They often argue that blue growth is needed to increase jobs, local incomes, etc. Yet there may be many significant gaps between that rhetoric around jobs and the reality. The distribution of economic benefits in many resource-dependent communities are often highly inequitable, and that was a conversation that came up quite a bit at the World Small-Scale Fisheries Congress, with processing plants often being owned by foreign companies and a lot of the profits going elsewhere rather than staying within local communities. Seventh, we highlight social and cultural impacts of blue growth initiatives. For example, blue carbon initiatives have often struggled to integrate local knowledge, traditional customs and livelihood rights in ways that are, and are developed in ways that are damaging to those systems. Eighth, a lot of blue growth initiatives further marginalize women. For example, in Kenya, access to finance was found to be a key constraint in women's ability to participate in coastal tourism and blue growth initiatives. As well, gender pay discrimination is also pervasive, with women receiving lower wages and less for their contributions to blue growth initiatives. And we give an example of a blue carbon credit market in which has significantly higher wages for men than for women who would like to participate. Ninth, we highlight human and indigenous rights abuses associated with blue growth initiatives. For example, potential enclosures of coastal seas can limit rights to fishing and navigation for indigenous peoples and small-scale fishers. And we provide examples of aquaculture initiatives with rights abuses in First Nations communities in Canada and seawater desalination initiatives in Chile. And finally, oftentimes, a final risk of these sort of blue growth initiatives, and one that likely precedes or exacerbates previously discussed injustices, is the exclusion of local communities and small-scale fishers from these decision-making processes. So the good news, I hope, is that we do sort of flip those 10 risks, which we identified through the literature review, into a set of 10 considerations which we advocate would support blue justice and sort of equity in these ongoing ocean transformations or blue growth initiatives. I won't go through them all because I'm keeping my eye on the time, but I highlight them because I think it's important that as we provide critiques and highlight risks, we also highlight potential pathways forward. And so I guess I would just like to conclude by saying that what I'm hopeful is that this framework for just transformations and these set of solutions for advancing blue justice might be part of these pathways that we are looking for to help support small-scale fisheries as they move from vulnerability, various stages, sometimes not vulnerable at all, but as they move into really viable positions there, where their decision-making power, their pre-existing rights and tenure, and their inclusion in the distribution of benefits are really at the forefront of these initiatives. So that is all. I really thank you for joining me, and I look forward to some discussion.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I mean, you touched upon so many aspects of vulnerability and viability. I mean, in the context of this particular talk and in the webinar series. I mean, if you start to kind of put them all together, it gives us a series of issues and also a series of opportunities and to work on in order to get to the transformation and the bright side of transformation. So that's wonderful. Thank you. So I'm going to kind of read out the questions from the audience that is watching on YouTube, and I read it out because everybody can listen, hear the question and then your response following that. So And the first one is from Ajibade Matthew from Lagos State University in Nigeria. Thank you for the talk. Would it be possible to summarize the whole lecture in a few bullet points? Basically, if there are any key messages, that you would like to concisely present.
Thank you for that question. That is a fun challenge. I would say if I tried to summarize it in maybe 3 bullet points, I would say, firstly, calls for radical change in ocean resource use are rapidly spreading. Secondly, there are massive risks associated with those calls for transformative change, and we need to always bear those risks at front of mind. And then thirdly, I think that there's a lot of promise in these frameworks from the environmental justice literature and the just transformations literature to help us navigate these large-scale changes, which are likely coming whether we want them or not, in ways that really highlight issues of equity and highlight the rights of small-scale fisheries communities. I think those are my three take-home points. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. The question from Derek Armitage, and Derek writes, thanks, Jessica, really insightful talk. You remind us that calls for transformation are often in conflict, or at least intention. Transformation to secure rights for SSF may be in conflict with neoliberal blue economy ideas, which you talked about, of course, or fences and fines conservation, sometimes linked to the 30 by 30 imperative. As a partnership that aims to support more viable SSF, how can we or should we navigate these tensions? Should we engage with these discourses if it is somewhat easy to go out?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Derek. I think that I've got 2 thoughts on that. Super important question. First is that acknowledging the trade-offs and being explicit about them and transparent about them is really important. I think we are often asked to buy into the win-win-win narratives and sort of dust the trade-offs under the table. And I think, number one, being really explicit about the fact that often these things are in conflict is really critically important. And then secondly, I would point us to the work of other bigger thinkers than I, who are looking at how we navigate trade-offs. And I was really fortunate to be participating in a workshop on Canada's Blue Economy Strategy yesterday with a really transdisciplinary group, and Alida Bundy and Rob Stevenson, who work for the Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans, are working with well-established frameworks for navigating trade-offs. And I think that we should look to their work and the work on navigating trade-offs in order to really be explicit about the fact that these are not going to be win-win-win scenarios, but rather they're complicated. Let's call it what it is, and then let's use established frameworks in order to try and navigate trade-offs in a way that is not damaging or less damaging, particularly to small-scale fisheries communities.
While we're waiting for more questions to flow in from YouTube, I just wanted to kind of ask you something relating to our initiatives within vulnerability to viability. So the notion of vulnerability to viability is, of course, as a continuous process, so you move from, being vulnerable to viable, of course, in a systems approach, not at any given point in time, the entire system is going to be either vulnerable or viable. So there are components of it that are going to be vulnerable and other components might be struggling. And if I put your last a few slides or last topic that you dealt with, the blue economy and the blue justice. So kind of, it struck to my mind, if you're looking at V2V transition in a way that parallels with the transition that you were talking about from blue economy challenges to blue justice challenges. So one is more akin to, viability, and the other one, more closely associated or triggers as we see and analyze, vulnerabilities. So blue economy, transitioning from blue economy, blue growth to blue justice could be seen as a transition from vulnerability to, viability in many ways. But my question is, if we know that there are many, a dark side of transformation that are going to be triggered by blue economy, why engage with it?
That's such a good question. Yeah, and I think that's one of the big challenges, I think, for our community over the next few years, because like it or not, global processes get set in place and every country is now developing a blue economy strategy, and the risks are very high. But there's also opportunity. The blue economy is a word like transformation, which can mean whatever we want it to mean. And so I guess I take heart in the fact that some of the blue economy initiatives are unfolding in a way that is trying to account for elements of recognitional and procedural justice. Mm-hmm. So, for example, Canada's blue economy strategy, before it was begun, they consulted with close to 2,000 people across Canada. I was part of a roundtable with the Ministry of the Department of Fisheries and the Minister of Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and they've already produced a document which is called What We Heard. And I was skeptical going into reading that, but when I read it, there's large components of equity and justice that were articulated by various groups across the country that they've put into print, and they've said, we've heard you, that we recognize these things are important. We'll see how much that transpires into the actual strategy that comes out, but I'm happy to see that that's there. Mm-hmm. But it is a huge challenge, and being part of transdisciplinary processes is challenging because we all bring different constraints because of our institutions. We all bring different priorities that we think are the most important. Like, clearly, I am going to advocate for equity, and that's largely a result of my training. But some of the challenges are very much around how you work across organizations. Like, for example, at lunch yesterday, I overheard an unnamed policy person saying to another policy person, oh, blue justice, like, how long is that going to take? And so there are challenges, we advocate for it, but these things are really complex and they are very long term. And when we're dealing with issues of recognitional justice that deal with legacies of colonialism, the challenges are high.
Yeah, I know there are a few more questions, but just a quick follow-up on that. So maybe a good starting point is not, looking at blue economy and then bring in blue justice to talk about, what might result from that and how to address it. But the starting point is actually, I'm learning from and drawing from your, discussion, is that a good starting point is actually blue justice, or rather blue injustice. That would then lead to, how we approach blue economy, blue growth, being aware of the historical and the systemic, justice issues that are already, well understood, and are there and have been studied. So that could be a good starting point. So just flip the, sequence in which, a lot of scholars are looking at, to, from blue economy to blue justice, rather than, blue justice or blue injustice to, blue economy or blue growth. Could be, another way to look at. Okay, so we have more questions flowing in. Niawung Richard, thanks, Jessica, for presentation. When do people or community know they need to transform? And who should lead the transformation, the people or external donors?
Yes, thank you. I adore that question. And I think it's absolutely, nobody should ever tell you you have to transform. We talked about this at the World Small Scale Fisheries Congress, is like, who gets to define what is vulnerable and who gets to decide what needs transformation? And I think the second half of your question really speaks to that, is that it should only, in my view, is only ever going to be equitable if it comes from the people who are doing the change or who want change. Externally driven programs of transformation, from what we know from the literature and past case studies, of which there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, are that transformational change driven from the outside are going to be highly risky and damaging to local communities. So yeah, I love that point, that the notion for transformation, the request should only ever come from somebody who wants to change rather than is told that they have to.
Thank you, Jessica. The next question is from Faluke Ariola from Lagos State University in Nigeria. The strategies of good governance as itemized are very good. Good governance, stakeholders' participation, getting it right, etc. However, the implementation of these is an uphill task. How do you get the attention of institutions in charge of oceans and SSF to take responsibility? And the last bit is capitalized, actually.
Yeah, that's the important part. That's such a good question. And I think that's like what all of us are probably grappling with in our work, is everything is quite straightforward when it's on paper, but actually operationalizing that is a huge challenge. So I think starting with humility is hugely important. Learning from what has already been written and what has already been experienced is hugely important. And being committed to genuinely participatory processes that are not predetermined. If we want to engage in genuinely collaborative processes, we can approach them with already a framework in mind or already an outcome in mind. So trying to be humble, trying to start from scratch, essentially, start from an informed place of scratch where all community members are invited in a way that is appropriate for them, that is convenient for them, that is compensated for when it should be compensated for. People's time is clearly important. But then your point about how do we bring institutions on board that may not be interested in coming into those conversations is a huge challenge, and I don't know how to do that. I think we're all working on it. I'd be thrilled to hear other people's suggestions, because inviting people in ways that are respectful and appropriate doesn't always result in effective participation. So yeah, it's a huge challenge, and I appreciate the question.
Thank you. Thanks once again. Next question is from Anna Carolina from University of Waterloo. Hi, Jessica. Thank you for your amazing presentation. You mentioned migration as a key aspect of resilience, but also with negative implications to their well-being. My question is how to address migration in risky situations for people's lives. How to address the risk and be attentive to people's well-being and willing to stay, sorry.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's a really important one. And I think in my mind, it relates to the question we had about who should decide when it's time to transform. And I think that the forced climate migration from climate change is a huge, huge challenge for us. The report from the UK government, which I drew on, that spins it in the positive, I think is highly problematic, because a lot of the literature we see, which documents coastal communities, almost are always resistant to change. There's always, and so I think of the work of, for example, the Pacific Climate Warriors, who is a group of climate action oriented individuals from the Pacific Island. And one of their sort of taglines is, "We're not drowning, we're fighting." And so they're very resistant to this notion of being vulnerable victims who need to move. And they're saying, actually, we reject that framing. And instead, they're fighting as hard as they can to stay in place. And so I think that work of John Barnett and Saffron O'Neill, which says there actually needs to be a legal requirement that we do cut greenhouse gas emissions to mitigate climate change so that people aren't forced to leave in life-threatening situations, like you mentioned, maybe aspirational, but is hugely important. I think it's not too late to give up on that kind of notion for the need for extreme mitigation action so that people aren't being forced to leave when they don't want to.
Thank you once again, Anna, for the question, and Jessica for responding to that. And the next question is from Maria Batgalia. Thank you for an insightful talk. As researchers, what is our responsibility and what tools can we offer to coastal communities to demand for more equitable governance, giving the power, to people?
Thank you. That's a really great question. And it's something that we all reflect on, I think, and that was been sort of front of the conversations this week, which I've really appreciated. And I think as researchers, we need to be very aware of what we can offer to coastal communities, but also what the limitations of our contributions are to them. A line from the workshop yesterday, which made me laugh, is that we heard from government that academic papers don't do anything. But they did say, to be, pragmatic about it, discussions around academic papers can influence policy. So I think as researchers, a sort of best practices involve early discussions with coastal communities that ask what their aspirations are and ask how we can support those aspirations are important, and being transparent about what we can do and what we can't do. We have a fairly limited set of contributions, but we can contribute. So I think letting coastal communities inform us about how we can apply our set of research skills and writing skills to support their initiatives is one promising way, to work with them.
Yeah. So one more question from Derek, but probably this question is more relevant from the perspective of our work at the B2B Global Partnership, which we all are part of, of course. So Derek is asking, what can we do as a global partnership, that is the B2B Global Partnership, to push towards the types of transformation we might value? Is that even a good idea?
I love that question. I've been thinking a lot lately about how our role should largely be in the background, and maybe if we're asking for one thing that we can do, I am of the opinion lately that highlighting the work that is already happening by coastal communities in coastal communities is a really potentially important way that we can contribute. So we have access to global policy platforms, and we have the ear of policymakers and the federal governments in the places we work, and provincial governments. And so in my mind, one of the ways that we can be supportive of transformational change is to just amplify the types of resistance efforts and the types of mobilization that coastal fisheries communities have been taking for decades or centuries or more. I think in India, the work of the National Fishers Forum has been going on since the 60s or before. But in my perspective, those really well established and really strong resistance movements are not well enough amplified. And so maybe that's one of the ways that we as a partnership, and maybe I'm thinking through my knowledge mobilization hat, but to me, that's one of the ways that we can be supportive of change that is rooted in coastal communities and driven by coastal communities. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions, but we are also almost at time, Jessica. So thank you very much. So this has been a wonderful, ongoing discussion. Of course, the number of papers and the, work that you and your colleagues have done on this particular topic is really meaningful. But at the same time, the effort here is to how do we learn from, your work on this important topic and apply to our own initiatives and activities, in this context, the B2B Global Partnership itself, because to talk about vulnerability to viability, it's so loaded, I mean, sometimes you feel so insufficient in terms of, really, even working on 5% of what, that term, the name suggests. But I'm sure with the kind of work that, you just presented and many other colleagues have done around the world, and the initiatives that exist, we can learn enough to deliver on the promise that B2B kind of makes. and we are all in that together, I believe, and I'm sure. And we can continue this through this kind of discussions into the future. So thank you very much once more, and for making the time and really kind of hashing out on and hammering many of those topics for us and the audience and everybody who is focused on small-scale fisheries communities, vulnerability to viability, but also to highlight how important is issues of justice, equity, and related topics for that kind of a transition or say transformation from vulnerability to viability. Thank you very much once again, and a huge thank you to all the people that joined us and listened to and engaged in asking really wonderful questions, meaningful questions. So this is the beginning of this discussion, I believe. Thank you very much. And before you go, we have a quick announcement about our next thematic webinar. I'll take a few seconds to announce the next month, that is the V2B thematic webinar in July, which is by Kurban Rouhani from South Africa. Kurban is at the Rural Fisheries Program in the Department of, at the University of, it's the Rhodes University in South Africa. And he is going to focus on the democratizing South Africa's inland fisheries from colonial objectives to constitutional imperatives. He has been doing some very wonderful work in the inland fisheries sector in South Africa, which we're aiming to learn from in the next month's thematic webinar series. And you all were welcome to join us for another episode of wonderful discussion and presentations. Thank you very much once again to everyone. Bye-bye.